We all know Gibson as a brand that is still making all of their guitars in the US today. Anything that you go buy with the Gibson brand on it is going to be made in the USA. But for a short period of time, they are making some guitars in Japan, not under the Gibson name, but named Orville, named after Gibson's founder, Orville Gibson. The Orville line would run for 10 years from 1988 to 1998 and be exclusive to the Japanese market. These were intended to bridge the gap between the new at the time Epiphone guitars being made in Korea, such as the Epiphone Les Pauls, and the USA-made Gibson guitars. In order to understand the need for these Orville guitars a little more, we have to set the scene a bit for what was going on in the Japanese guitar market at the time. Since the 1970s, brands like Greco and Tokai were making really great quality Les Paul style guitars for the Japanese market primarily, and these were a lot more cost effective than the Gibson guitars. You could get these a lot cheaper and the quality was really, really great. At the time also, Gibson distribution in Japan was a little bit rough and stuff wasn't as available as it is now. In the 1970s, Gibson infamously filed a lawsuit against Ibanez specifically for using their open book headstock as well as other trademarks. And the ruling was that Ibanez could no longer use this open book headstock design. While the ruling would stand in the US, Japanese trademark law did not protect Gibson, so in Japan, companies could still use this open book headstock, leaving a lot of companies to continue to make open book headstock Les Paul style guitars as well as SGs and other kinds of Gibson guitar kind of copies over there. So in Japan, Gibson had a problem. A weak yen led to American-made Gibson guitars being quite expensive in Japan, and these Japanese-made Greco, Tokai, and other branded guitars were not only more affordable, but they often got close to the quality of the equivalent Gibson models. These MIJ guitars were much better than the Korean-made Epiphone guitars at the time, so Gibson clearly had a pretty big gap in their product offering. In 1988, Gibson decided to throw their hat in the ring and start their own brand of Japanese guitars called Orville. These guitars were made in the Toretta factory. Gibson was already contracting the Toretta factory to make guitars on their Epiphone branding, such as their semi-hollow and hollow body guitars. That brings us here, this 1988 Orville by Gibson Les Paul Custom. This guitar features a lacquer finish and Gibson USA pickups, which is a really big step up for Japanese guitars of their time. The original retail of these was 93,000 yen, which was a bit more than the typical Greco or Tokai would run, but most Grecos and Tokai guitars would usually have a poly finish. Some would have nitro, but most would be poly, and obviously none of them were featuring Gibson USA electronics, so this was a pretty worthy upgrade. At the time of its release, if you wanted to buy a Gibson USA Les Paul Custom, it would cost 250,000 yen. So pricing the Orville by Gibson at 93,000 was actually a really, really great value, especially factoring the specs of this. This is a fantastic Les Paul Custom. To me, this is really everything you would want out of a Gibson Les Paul Custom. This particular example has a pretty thin neck, very 60s style, and I really, really like it. This one's yellowed out a bit as it is a lacquer finish, so it's gonna age over time, but I would say this one has aged beautifully. No surprise, the Gibson USA pickups do sound as you'd expect. This is just a solid Les Paul Custom overall. The 1988 catalog was pretty lean, featuring only a few models. At the time, you could buy a Orville by Gibson Les Paul Standard, Les Paul Custom, single and double cutaway juniors, an SG Standard, and an ES335. Starting in 1989, the Orville line would be split into two different tiers. They would continue making the Orville by Gibson guitars with the lacquer finish and USA pickups, but they would also introduce a just standard Orville line. This would not say Orville by Gibson, but just Orville on the headstock. These guitars would feature a poly finish and Japanese-made electronics, which made them a lot more economical. Because of these modifications to the specs, these could be priced a lot more in line with other Japanese-made Les Paul style guitars of the time, making these even more competitive. In the coming years, Orville would continue to sell both lines concurrently, both the Orville line and the Orville by Gibson line. This is a 1990 Orville Les Paul Standard. You will notice the headstock now only says Orville and does not say Orville by Gibson, and this was part of their new tier. This is a very solid Les Paul Standard. I have to say I do slightly prefer the sound of the Les Paul Custom we just checked out, but this is still really, really solid. Once again, this one has a pretty slim neck. This one's probably even slimmer than the Gibson USA Les Paul standards of the time, but I really, really like it. This one has a poly finish, so the finish hasn't aged as much, but the plastics and the bindings certainly have aged on this one. And once again, this is a solid Les Paul. One fun fact I want to point out with these is the sticker number serial. Initially, the standard Orville guitars did not include a serial number from the factory, so a silver sticker was added for warranty purposes by the Yamanogaki company, who were distributing the guitars. The K here stands for Kuomai, the company's wholesale division. I've seen some people speculate online that some Orville guitars were made in Korea, but from all my research, they've only ever made guitars in Japan. So this K does not stand for Korea, it stands for Kuomai. As well as the introduction of the lower tier Orville guitars, by 1991 the offerings were also widened in regards to models. We now see the introduction of a Flying V, Explorer, Firebird, Melody Maker, Thunderbird bass, and EB bass. As the 90s progressed, you would see even more models added and even an acoustic guitar range. This is the Orville MM65 Melody Maker, which is one of the hardest guitars to find in the Orville line. I actually found this one last month in Japan while shopping at the Economizu Guitar Street, and I grabbed it just for this video as it was the only one that I had ever seen in person. This might be the most fun of all the guitars we're checking out today. This actually has a little bit thicker neck on it. The single humbucker sounds great, and what's not to love? This is a super straightforward guitar, nice and thin. It's just cool. This once again features that K serial sticker. Between 1993 and 1994, production would shift away from the Toyota factory and over to the Fujigen factory. We also now got the inclusion of a Les Paul Special within the line. The Orville Les Paul Special would be most closely based off the Gibson USA Les Paul Specials of the time, the ones that carry the Junior 2 branding. Both the Orville and Gibson guitars feature a 60s neck profile and tunematic bridge, allowing you to dial in proper intonation. If you know my taste in guitars, then you know I absolutely love these. At the same time as this, Gibson was making a similar guitar in the Gibson USA range called the Junior 2, which are some of my favorite Gibsons ever made. Aesthetically, they kind of have the 50s vibes, but they feature a tunematic bridge to allow for spot-on intonation, and you also get a pretty slim neck, which is not accurate for the 50s. I like these. The Orville is very true to the Gibson, and they're both solid options. The Orville version features P90 pickups, more true to the 50 specs, while the Gibson version includes P100 pickups. The P100 pickups are actually humbuckers, as they do have a second coil, so there's no hum. They sound great, but they're a little bit hotter than like the pickups in this. The Junior 2 will definitely sound a bit hotter than this guitar will, but this probably will sound more like a 50s Les Paul Special. By 1995, the higher tier Orville by Gibson range would be discontinued, but the standard Orville guitars would continue to be produced until 1998. This is a 1998 Fujigen-made LPS75 Les Paul Gold Top. This is one of the last guitars made under the Orville branding. I can definitely see an evolution of these guitars over the years, and I really like where they landed on this one. Obviously, being that this is from the Orville range and not the Orville by Gibson range at this point, it's a little bit more budget focused, but the quality on this is exceptional. I would really put this right there with almost any Gibson that I've played. I will say this one is definitely my favorite of the two Les Paul standards that we checked out today. Even though this has a poly finish and Japanese-made pickups, this is still really, really great. Great wood selection. I mean, look at the fretboard on this one. It's really, really nice. I would say the Fujigen factory definitely was on the top of their game when they made this particular example. This is a good one. Now, these guitars would not totally go away after 1998, but the Orville branding would. Some of these models would still be offered now under the Epiphone branding, known as the Epiphone Japan domestic line. These guitars would be nearly identical in specs and still include the open book headstock. I don't want to dig as deep into the Epiphone guitars today, but here is a first year of the Epiphone Japan domestic line. This is nearly identical to the Orville that we just checked out in specs, but it just says Epiphone now. I do like the gold top better than this one, but they're both really solid and they are pretty similar. This Japan domestic line would later be replaced by the Epiphone Elite and then Epiphone Elitist lines, which interestingly would actually see export to the States, as you know, these Japan domestic guitars were only made for Japan, but some of the Elite and Elitist guitars would make their way overseas. While some of these guitars were exported to the US, there was one major omission, which was the open book headstock. The export version of the Elite and Elitist guitars would feature a different headstock, and the open book headstock version would still stay exclusive to Japan. It actually wasn't until very recently that Gibson had a Epiphone branded guitar with the open book headstock made for the US market. These Orville guitars of all varieties are well celebrated today, and for good reason. Looking at where these guitars sat price-wise compared to the other options of their era, I think they were an incredible value, and I think Gibson really succeeded on the mission of having instruments in this subset of the market. I've often seen the sentiment shared online that Gibson discontinued the Orville line since it was too close to the Gibson guitars but at a lower price point, but I don't think that that's necessarily true. It's entirely possible that there's some truth to that regarding the Epiphone Elite and Elitist lines, but even with those at that point, I don't think they were that close to the Gibson guitars since they changed the specs so much at that point. But I do think these guitars really succeeded at what Gibson was trying to do, and the reason that they were discontinued, I think, is a lot more to do with just how the market was changing than that they were too close to the Gibson guitars. Looking at where things were at in the late 80s, I think they definitely accomplished what they were after. These guitars did a great job of competing with other MIJ Les Paul style guitars at the time, but with the official endorsement and branding of Gibson. By the early 2000s, the guitar market landscape had definitely changed a lot, and I really don't know if there was a place in the market for these Orville guitars. The price and quality relationships were kind of changing between US, Japan, Korea, China, and just things were kind of evolving at that point. By this point, it was a really tough proposition for Gibson to want to offer a Japan-made guitar in the US under one of their sub-brands. The cost would have been so close to like a Gibson USA guitar that it would have been really hard to market, like, where does this guitar fall? Because it's like notably more expensive than the Korean or Chinese Epiphones, and only a little bit less than the American-made Gibson guitars, and obviously not as well known as the US Gibson guitars. At this point, it was just kind of time for Gibson to stop offering a lot of these Japanese-made guitars, as there wasn't really just a great place in their lineup for them. Given that the Epiphone line currently made in China, price point-wise, goes right up into Gibson USA, I just don't really know where a line like this would fit in anymore, unfortunately. On a personal note, I'll say that I really prefer these Orville and Orville by Gibson guitars, as well as the Epiphone Japan domestic lines, over the current production Chinese-made Epiphone lines. I do think Gibson's made some great strides today in regards to their Epiphone line being made in China and all that good stuff. I do think they're solid guitars, but I just really prefer these and see these in a much higher kind of class than I see the current Epiphone guitars. I think if you're looking to get into the Gibson range and maybe you're considering going Epiphone, I think checking out the Orville stuff is definitely worth doing. For around the same price as one of the more premium Epiphone guitars of today, you can get a really solid Orville, and I think that really in every way, these are better guitars. Even if you're somebody who already has a Gibson USA guitar, I would still check out the Orville and Orville by Gibson guitars. I would say they're just as much guitar as the Gibson is, but kind of with their own flavor, so I'd still check these out. Thank you guys so much for watching and hanging out with us today. I had a lot of fun going through all these guitars. Have you played any Orville guitars? Please let us know down below in the comments. Also, if you have an Orville, please let us know and let us know what you got. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and all that good stuff, and we will see you in another video soon. Bye.